Hi, Geshe. Hello, Aviv.
Hello, everybody. Just a few opening words, please. First of all, we're starting the recording.
Hello, Aviv.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I remind you, we're also broadcasting on YouTube. So if you need to, you can also watch it over there. Also, please activate your cameras if you can. If you need the text, they're on the website, on the page of the event. And also very important, the details for Dana. So I remind you that whatever you contribute goes to expenses of Dharma friends and of course to our great teacher. Hope we have a great lesson. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, shalom. Nice to be back. Hi. All right, well, let's continue with the Heart Sutra. Especially with this part, with a part of the Heart Sutra called the 8 aspects or the 8 profundities. We've been talking about those when it says in English, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unseized, stainless, not without stains, not deficient, not fulfilled. And usually, most explanations or most commentaries pay more attention to the 4 profundities, saying form is empty, emptiness is form. Of course, that's so extremely important and is seen as one of the central or the essential part of the Heart Sutra. In particular, not just saying that the body lacks inherent existence, in other words, form is empty, or the I is empty, it doesn't exist the way it appears to us, but also saying that emptiness is the I. And as I mentioned last time, the Sanskrit word for emptiness is shunyata, or shunyata, and it's one of the syllables is shunya, which is another word for zero, which is the Sanskrit word for zero. And as you probably know, it was founded, it was discovered, or it was created, if you like. It's actually a symbol, of course, a man-made symbol, created by an Indian mathematicians. But the theory goes, or historically, the belief is that it had its foundation, it had its basis in the understanding of shunyata, emptiness. Based on that, the idea of zero was found, or came forth. And what's important is shunyat means void, it means empty, zero, etc. But one of its syllables denotes growth and hollow. So hollow as in like it contains something. Something is possible. If something is hollow, you can fill it with something. Growth, of course, anything is possible. So the fact that phenomena lack this concrete, solid existence that to our mind seems to be there, but actually is impossible, cannot be found, it does not uphold to reasoning. So therefore, anything is possible because the I doesn't exist inherently, therefore it can actually exist. And that's true for anything. So therefore, shunya, as in like being one, and of course, as meaning zero, as in like anything is possible. But also what's fascinating is that as a placeholder, so for instance, in combination with other numbers, 1, 2, 3, it amounts to a lot, 100, 1,000. So depending on how many zeros you add in combination with 1, 2, 3, it symbolizes a lot. So although it's zero, it's nothing, anything is possible, in other words. So that's true for shunyata as well, and expressed by the words emptiness is form. Or if you want to say emptiness is the I can only exist because it lacks inherent existence. All right, so I talked a lot about this before, no need to go into more details on this, but we're now talking about the 8 profundities or the 8 aspects. saying that not only are things empty of inherent existence, but they lack any inherent characteristics. All right, just to remind you, what is a characteristic? To be long or short, for instance. Okay, to take the flower. The stem of this flower, is it long? Is it short? Is there something inherent in this flower that makes it long or short? No, there's nothing inherent in it. It's only in relation to something longer that we call it short, and in relation to something shorter, we call it long. There's nothing within this object that we can call longness or shortness. So as these characteristics. Also its color, in relation to its color, does it have some inherent, some color that's natural to it? Well, no, it doesn't. Actually, those are just light waves. And in relation to how these light waves affect my retina, and in relation to how it appears to my eye, I call this green. Okay, it's not in and of itself green. In fact, there's no color to be found. And even the light waves are just bouncing off this object. So there's nothing, no color within it. So I'm not sure I talked about this. Now I'm getting a little confused because I've been doing a lot of things at the same time, teaching different classes. And please tell me if I've told you this before, but what is so difficult to understand is the object to be negated here. So, although, yeah, I've said it before, but what is the object we're negating? It's actually a characteristic that has never existed, doesn't exist now, and will never exist. But nonetheless, we wrongly perceive it. And that characteristic is differently described. There are different words that describe this characteristic. One word that we use is, what is it? Inherent or intrinsic. That's one word. What does that actually mean? Then there's another word called is independent. That independent existence is impossible. And then what else? Objective existence. Objective, inherent, intrinsic, independent. But we use those words every day. So what are you saying? We can't use those words any longer? No, because these words, the way we use them, we don't use them in the way in which they're denied here. We use them in the relative sense. We don't use them in the literal sense of the word itself. Does that make sense? For instance, when we say independent, is there anything that exists independently? Well, Israel is an independent country. You would say Israel is independent. I live an independent life. Is that true? Yes, it is true. Did I talk about this before, Lior? Did I say that before? Or anyone else? No? No, I didn't, right? Okay. So, no.
We did talk about the first two in the 8 divisions, empty and without characteristics, but we didn't go into the object of negation and so forth.
All right, so I'll do that before I continue with the 8 aspects or 8 profundities. So when we say things don't exist independently, and when we use it, on the other hand, to refer to Israel as an independent country, well, saying Israel is an independent country is only in relation to certain aspects, because Israel is not totally independent. That would be ridiculous. There's no country in this world that is totally independent of all the other countries in terms of the environment, in terms of water, in terms of the clouds, in terms of oxygen, etc. So of course there's an interdependence of all other countries. I'm not talking about politically, but just environmentally, physically. And of course, also these days, economically, there's great dependence on other countries. Israel being dependent on other countries and vice versa. And of course, politically too. Therefore, when we say Israel is an independent country, it's in relation to certain aspects that your prime minister can, is it still? I'm out of touch. Still same person? Still Bibi?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Still Bibi. All right, so it's still Bibi. So because Bibi can make certain decisions that Israel is independent, as an example. And of course, Bibi doesn't make these decisions totally independently. There's a whole institution, like a whole political system that he needs to follow. And of course, his knowledge, etc. All that plays into it. So when we say Israel is an independent country, there's no absolute independence, but a relative independence. Okay? Which is why when we use it as the object of negation, we're saying literally, in the literal sense of the word, the sense that something can be totally independent, can interact with other things, but is in essence is independent. That's how things appear to us. And that's really difficult to recognize. So there are actually two difficulties when it comes to understanding emptiness. First of all, to recognize how we misperceive things, because we don't know it any other way. In fact, not only do we actively misapprehend phenomena to exist inherently, moreover, what we also do is we, due to our habit, habitually perceiving things to exist inherently, that left what is called imprints, that left something on our mind. It left something behind, some residue that is called imprint, whatever you want to call it. It left something behind of our mind and is on our mind, and is now responsible for the fact that whenever something appears to us, it appears to exist inherently. So if I think about a table, the table appears inherently. If I see a table, and I see a table right now, in fact, I've got one in front of me, that table appears to exist inherently to my eye consciousness. You, when I look at your picture, you appear to exist inherently. When I think of independently, I seem to, inherently or independently. So because of my wrong perception of things existing inherently, independently, objectively, whatever I want to use, I have this appearance to all my awarenesses. Anything that appears to my mind always appears with that characteristic. Okay, sorry, I got a little confused with the usage of words that I use, but the point is that I don't know it any other way. I have no experience of anything appearing to me in any other way other than independently, inherently, etc. That's why it's so difficult to understand what is the Buddha talking about? What does that mean? Because to me, a table is an independent table. Now, what am I saying here? I'm saying, yeah, to a certain degree, it's dependent. Maybe to a certain degree, it's dependent on, say, maybe its causes. So that's more intellectually that I'm saying, yes, the table is independently. Of course, I know that it needed a carpenter, I needed someone to make it, etc. But on an emotional, on a deeper level, that's not how it appears. It seems like that's always been a table, and there's no sense for me. It's just this intellectual knowledge that it must have had a cause, but none of its appearances suggests that it's dependent on those. There's nothing suggests that it's dependent on light. Nothing suggests it to me when it appears to me. It just seems to be a table. Okay? So therefore, the way it appears to me on this deeper kind of emotional level, especially when I think about it, as if an independent table. And then not even on that deeper emotional level, but just with my sense consciousnesses, nothing suggests that there were causes and conditions that gave rise to it. All right. Therefore, it is so hard to recognize what the Buddha is actually talking about, to identify our wrong perception, because that seems like seeing a table, it's wrong. Seeing anything makes it wrong to a certain degree. We were mistaken with regard to this appearance of inherent existence, or independent existence. So therefore, how else would something appear? This we find really difficult to pinpoint, and therefore we have a hard time to identify how we perceive things wrongly, and then to understand what that wrong perception entails and what it would be like when things don't exist that way. How it would still be possible to still exist, to be conventionally existent. So we're up to a huge challenge, not because it's difficult to realize emptiness. It isn't, if we have the right kind of mind. Because the understanding of emptiness requires a certain type of mind, which in our case is just totally and utterly affected by our sense of inherent existence. Okay, now, having said that, again, going back to independent existence, so things, although we intellectually know they must have had causes and conditions, that's not how they appear. And still, we use the word independent, but however, in a conventional, in a relative sense. Now, another word that we use is the word objective. There's nothing that exists objectively. Things don't exist objectively. Even scientists have moved away from the idea that there's an objective reality. Initially, when science, modern science, as it evolved, when it developed about 400 years ago, God was still a huge part in the idea of science. So they used words such as the God's perspective. So how do things exist from the perspective of God? Our perspective, of course, is limited, but how do things really exist? The God's perspective, or as it often nowadays it's called sometimes the bird perspective, as if we could kind of like a bird look at everything from above without involving a subjective aspect. And initially that was the idea. The scientists provide us with knowledge about the objective existence of this world. And slowly, over the years, over the centuries, scientists understood that to know something scientifically, what is it that knows? Our mind. What is it that measures? What is it that counts? What is it that does all the measurements and whatever you need to do to come to some kind of scientific recognition or understanding? It's the mind. And our mind is limited in what it can perceive. So everything, every knowledge, every scientific knowledge is a subjective knowledge, right? It's not objective. And just because we all agree that the color is blue of the object we see and that it's 10 centimeters long, etc., it doesn't mean we perceive the same. We just use the same symbols to refer to it. We believe because we call it long, oh, the other person says it's long, I say it's long, so therefore it must be objectively long. But the long that I perceive and that you perceive could be so different, and we only choose to call it long. Okay, so again, the idea, we believe we call it long because it is long, or rather it becomes long because we call it such. And the basis for calling it long could be different in both cases, in all cases, because we all perceive it differently. We have a different perspective. Longness is a shape that can only appear if there's color. So in the case of seeing an object with our eye consciousness, it's the color that enables us to perceive something as long, different shades at least, because otherwise you couldn't distinguish it from the background, right? If it's got the same color background as well as the object itself, you wouldn't be able to distinguish. If you put this in front of a background that has got the same color, you couldn't see this. It's even difficult here. You have a hard time probably seeing this. I mean, I don't know, but here with the contrast, you can see it's green. But if you put the same background, you can no longer see its shape. So shape is dependent on color, but color, as modern physics tell us, is totally subjective because it's actually just light waves. So obviously shape must be subjective. And as I said, if we call it long, that just means we call a certain basis of imputation the same, while the basis of imputation for each one of us appears differently, is therefore different. All right, but when we say everything is subjective, nothing exists subjectively. In other words, because we call it this, that, and the other, therefore it exists. And that which calls it something is the mind thinking it is this, that, and the other. So when we say designating or labeling, actually what is doing the labeling is a Conceptual mind is the mind thinking it is long. Every time I think it is long, I'm labeling. Therefore, it's totally subjective because it requires a thought. It is this, that, and the other, and that is subjective. However, can we use the word objective in everyday life? Of course we do. We do all the time when we say, oh, let's not get upset. Let's look at the problem objectively, right? In a situation when emotions run high and everyone gets excited, and then someone suggests, well, we're not going to find a solution. Let's just look at it objectively. Does that mean literally in the sense of the word objectively? No, it doesn't. It means in relation to leaving aside certain emotions. Let's leave those emotions aside and then look at it subjectively. That's actually what we mean. In the literal sense of the word, we couldn't look at something and do so because looking at something means subjectively. Each one of us using our mind, right? The mind itself, only that can look at the situation. So it is by definition subjective. When we say we look at it objectively, it's just conventional, it's just relative. Does that make sense? All right, okay, so therefore we use words in everyday language, but we use them in the literal sense of the word, as in like an absolute independent, an absolute objective, and then that is denied because obviously that's impossible, but it appears that way. And then there's another word that we use as the object of negation, and that's the word inherent, which actually just means intrinsic, kind of like natural to this thing. It is natural to it. It is intrinsic in it. So the example, I've given this example before, but I've explained it in a slightly different context. When we say it is natural to water to be hot, to be wet, and it's natural to fire to be hot, it seems that if you have fire, you automatically have heat. It's not dependent on anything. It's just there when you have fire. But that's not true. Just as water, we say water is not naturally cold or not naturally warm. It depends on other factors such as the temperature of the surrounding environment. Well, the same is true for the wetness of water. It depends on factors other than water itself. It depends on hydrogen and oxygen, for instance. It depends on other factors therefore. And moreover, wetness, what is wetness? Being wet in relation to my body, it's wet. For a fish, I don't think water is wet for a fish, right? A fish, does a fish have a sense of water being wet? I don't think so, right? It just lives in the water. It doesn't know anything about water. It wouldn't survive without water. I guess the perception of a fish when it comes to water is so different to, I mean, I don't know. I don't remember being a fish. I've definitely been one at some point, but don't remember. But my sense is there's no sense, today the water's really wet or anything like that. No, not at all. So therefore, water is only wet in relation to us. Fire is hot in relation to how we perceive it. If you have a living being that starts feeling really cold in the presence of fire, well, in relation to that being, fire is cold, right? Fire is cold. So we say a fire melts objects. Well, there's some objects that get harder when they're in the presence or close to fire. We say fire burns, but it doesn't burn everything, right? So it's in relation to certain material that it burns. Our skin, for instance. So usually it's in relation to us because it burns. Me, I say fire is burning because I consider it to be hot. I experience it to be hot. I therefore say water is hot. Fire is hot. It's natural to it. But it's natural to it. It isn't. It's dependent on many other factors. Very important, my own mind, my own body and my own mind. And therefore I perceive fire to be hot and water to be wet. So that's why conventionally we can say in relation to the fact that, all right, every time I perceive fire, I perceive it as hot. So therefore I say it's natural to fire to be hot, natural for fire to be hot. All right, in relation to that. But in the absolute sense of the word, it is not natural to it because it's not perceived in that way by everyone. By living beings that perceive it differently. In the case of wood, in the case of certain living beings that possibly experience fire very differently, or certain temperatures. Let's take 25 degrees. We had that before. An Indian person might put on a down jacket when it's 25 degrees somewhere, whereas someone from Germany or even higher up north would feel hot, especially after a really cold winter. When it's 25 degrees for the first time, they'd be sweating. But an Indian who's just arrived from somewhere, Rajasthan, where it's just been 50 degrees, in the shade, then this person, when they come to a place where it's 25 degrees, they'll be cold. So is it hot or is it cold? Is it intrinsically hot or intrinsically cold? It is neither. In relation to this Indian person, it is cold. In relation to this North European person, it is hot. Okay, so therefore we talk about something being natural too. It is natural too, but only in relation to other things. There is no absolute inherent, and that's what we're negating, that there's nothing inherent in the table that makes it a table. There is no color inherent in the table that makes it a table. So when we talk about the table as an entity itself, there's nothing natural in the table that we can find that makes it a table, and no characteristics such as a color or a shape that is natural to the table that can be found in the table. Okay, there's no independent table, something that can be found that just exists independently. Not there. There's therefore also no objective table, because that would require, independent means not dependent on the mind, but there's no objective table, therefore independence is impossible. And if it was intrinsic to the table to be a table, it would be objective, because it already would be one. It wouldn't need a mind to be one. We would just perceive it that way. So can you see the correlation between those words that are the object of negation? And they actually mean the same thing. There is no independent table, there's no inherent table, and likewise there is no objective table. They all mean the same thing. And that's denied, but not in the conventional sense, but in the absolute sense. All right. But of course, not just the object itself, the entity itself, but all its characteristics. None of those characteristics can be found. Now with the table, it's slightly easier understandable. It's easier to understand this, but it's not as effective as it is when it comes to the I, of course. No characteristic, there's no I within me. There's nothing intrinsic in me that I can call the I. It appears that way, but that is just a wrong perception, a mistaken appearance. There is nothing, no independent I, and there's no objective I, other than the I that is merely labeled by a subjective mind. So there's no characteristics. Likewise, and here we go further, so this is what it says here as part of those 8 profundities, with the first profundity just being emptiness itself, and then the next one without characteristics. All right, we've heard that. Then we talked about unproduced and unceased as part of last time's lesson, and I'll say something about that. So, likewise, here Avalokiteshvara explains there's nothing that is produced. There's no production, inherent, independent, objective production, and there's no inherent, objective and independent ceasing, that is going out of existence. Now, why do we look at this? Well, we talk about dependent arising. The word already, dependent arising, which is basically saying, well, phenomena don't exist inherently, so how do they exist? As dependently arisen phenomena. What do those 2 words mean? The first word means dependent, the second one means arising. It's not saying dependently existent, We don't talk about dependent existence. We talk about dependent arising. Although the Tibetan word can mean existing and can mean arising, both. But usually the definition that, or the translation that is used is the translation of arising. That is quite interesting because we don't just look at the way in which phenomena exist, but we also look into how they come into existence and how they therefore go out of existence. How do they come into existence? How do they go out of existence? Okay. Now, the simple process of a phenomenon coming into existence, it seems so clear. It seems there's just this process that's taking place, and we talk about a cause that produces or that gives rise to a result. So if you're a gardener, you're very much aware of that process. You're very much aware that if there are certain causes, they give rise to a certain effect. If you're a business person, you're very aware if you have all these causes and conditions come together, if all this comes together, a certain idea, a certain capital, etc., then this will eventually lead to that result. We're aware of that chain of events. If you're a cook, likewise, those ingredients put together at a certain time with a certain sequence and blah, blah, and everything you do with that leads to a certain dish. So therefore, this process, which seems to be so clear, and it seems to be so clear, this is the cause, this is the result, this is the function of the cause, this is the potential of the cause, and this is the result. Now, let's look at that. If I were to say, and I said this before many times, and I apologize if I bore you, but I still find this metaphor, this example, not the metaphor as much, but I find this example really effective also for myself. If I were to take the classic example of a cause and its result, classic example that we can think of that we find in the texts is of a flower seed, which then gives rise to a little sprout, and thereafter to what? A plant. Okay? And over a period of a certain time, a seed, it grows, it's the cause then of the sprout, with that sprout slowly developing into a plant. Okay? And so if I conventionally talk about this process, I say there's a cause, the seed, it has the potential to give rise to the sprout. And then that sprout in turn, that has the potential to grow into a plant, with the plant being the result of the sprout and the sprout being the result of the seed. It seems very straightforward. It's very clear what every cause as a cause does, that it has arisen, if it's an effect, etc. Now, it seems to be intrinsic in the seed. It seems to be natural to the seed, etc. But if we really, and independently, objectively so. But if I were to do the following, I take a camera and I take shots, I take photographs of each of those moments of the seed growing into the sprout and thereafter into a plant. If I take pictures each second and I put them up all over Tel-Aviv and I number each photograph, and I'll ask you first of all, when is the exact moment that the seed is no longer a seed, but that there's now the first moment of the sprout? Is there a correct answer or not? Correct answer? If there is an intrinsic, if there is a naturally occurring sprout, such that being a sprout is intrinsic to that sprout, it's got nothing to do with us calling it a sprout at a certain point, there would be a correct and a wrong answer. But in actuality, what is happening, and which you can follow with each photograph, there's an object that's neither a seed nor a sprout in and of itself. It's just a cluster of atoms that, because of certain characteristics that we perceive, that cluster of atoms we call a seed. And then those clusters of atoms, they start changing. These atoms start changing. And when they have changed enough, we start calling it a sprout. So we distinguish between the cluster of atoms that is called a seed and the cluster of atoms that have, because of the change, we call now a sprout. We could put in something in between that's called something else, neither seed nor sprout. Identify another object in between that holds certain characteristics and on the basis of which we label X, Y, or Z. But you get a sense, first of all, that when you take all these moments, there's just an object that is changing, right? And being a seed, being a sprout, it cannot be found within that because it's just a matter of calling it a seed or a sprout, which is very subjective, which calling means basically, literally, possibly giving it the name, but also the thought, oh, sprout, oh, seed. If I don't have all these photographs, if I have a picture of the seed today and this picture of the sprout tomorrow, it seems very clear-cut. This is seed, this is the sprout. But when we go down to the details, when we really go and check in detail, we find, no, we don't know when the sprout starts because it's totally subjective. Okay, so that aspect, that part, I think is clear. But now we don't just talk about the seed as a seed and the sprout as a sprout. We also talk about the sprout having been produced, right? Here, the word produced. And when the sprout gives rise to the plant, to the flower, we talk about the sprout ceasing, going out of existence to make way for this plant. In other words, the sprout transforms and becomes the plant. Likewise, the seed itself, it transforms initially and it becomes the sprout, which in turn transforms and becomes the plant. That's how we think about this. And we think there's this process that's independently taking place. But even that being produced cannot be found. Because if I cannot find a sprout that's in and of itself a sprout, other than me calling it a sprout, where is that quality of having been produced? In fact, the seed, I say the seed is producing the sprout. While the seed is there, I say, oh, right now it's acting as a cause of the sprout. In other words, right now it's producing the sprout. And I'm just calling it that in dependence on the fact that these atoms are changing in a certain way. Possibly in my thoughts, because I call it that, I may have this idea there's a little farmer inside that seed that's going, let's produce a sprout, let's produce a sprout, right? This saying there's this activity of production seems to suggest there's actually an agent that's actively producing something. But that's just the language we use in order to make sense of what is happening. The seed is responsible for the sprout, okay? But again, it's only labeled. There's no inherent production taking place. It's only labeled in dependence on how the seed evolves and transforms into a sprout. Am I making sense? Does that make sense? Right? So it seems there's a whole process taking place, but I'm just labeling it. And after I've labeled it, I believe it's taking actually place over there. And it's not that it's taking place. It's not actually, there's an actual production over there. And I'm just calling it there for production, right? No, sorry, the other way around. Not that it's only a production because I'm labeling it such, but I have a sense this production actually takes place, and therefore I'm labeling it. Does that make sense? So I'm even saying the seed has the potential to give rise to the sprout, right? The seed has the potential to give rise to a sprout. I have the potential to become a Buddha. And then I talk about Buddha nature, and it seems like as this little kneddelach, remember last time we talked about the kneddelach? There's a little kneddelach inside me. I love that word. Makes my mouth water, by the way. There's a little kneddelach within me that is now this kneddelach, that is the potential that I hold to be a Buddha. Or the seed has that little kneddelach within it that is the potential for that seed to transform into a sprout. But actually, if you look for that, there's nothing to be found. It's just something we call that, the fact that this seed, that we call a seed that transforms in such a way that we now call it a sprout, independence on that, we say the seed has the potential to become a sprout. I'll say that again. Only because a certain cluster of atoms, since we think of that cluster of atoms as a seed, we call it that, and we think of it as a seed. And then after that cluster of atoms having changed in such a way that now we refer to it, we think of it as being a sprout, for that reason we say, and we think of the seed having a potential to become a sprout. But once we think that way and we name it that way, we think of it, we label it that way, we then believe, oh, there's some potential in that seed, like a little kneddelach or whatever, in that seed, something intrinsic in that seed that now mysteriously gives rise. No, it's just labeled. Therefore, there is no potential that now, due to this potential, no intrinsic potential that's now producing in and of itself the seeds, the sprout. No, this production is only the way we describe it, the function we describe, which again, only in dependence on the fact that we call a cluster of atoms seeds and then we call it sprouts. And so therefore we say, we refer to this process as the function of the seed as production. But there is no production other than the one we label. There's no intrinsic production. There's no independent production. There's no objective production other than us, based on a cluster of atoms, calling it production. Does that make sense? Does it make sense to a certain degree? All right. And therefore, is there a seizing of the seed? No, there was no seed, no intrinsic seed in the first place. We stopped calling it a seed. And so therefore, we say the seed has ceased to exist, has gone out of existence. Why? Because we no longer call that cluster of atoms a seed. We call it sprout now. So we say now there's no longer a sprout because we call it no longer a sprout, because that basis, the cluster of atoms that were the basis of imputation for calling it or thinking seeds, is no longer there. Does that make sense? Which is why Avalokiteshvara says there is no production, no inherent production, and no inherent ceasing. Okay? So when we say, look at the sprout. The sprout, let's take, first is the seed, then the sprout, then the plant. If we focus on the object we call sprout, we say, because now we call it a sprout, we say it was produced by its cause, the object we previously called seed. Okay? When it was the cluster of atoms that we previously referred to as seed. So it is produced, we say. We say at the same time that sprout is remaining for some time, right? We say the sprout is there for some time. We don't immediately call it plant, do we? No, there are certain characteristics that we conventionally now have agreed upon to be called sprout. And since it's totally subjective, we disagree in the detail, like when we look at each photograph, but in general, we would say, okay, this is how long for this long we still refer to it as sprout, and then for this long we refer to it as plant. So now we say it's remaining, But actually, can you find any remaining? No, each moment is different to the next. Each moment of the sprout is different from the other, because the cluster of atoms that make up that sprout, the basis of imputation, is different each moment. Would you agree? In each moment, the cluster of atoms is not the same. The only reason we say that the sprout remains is because we keep calling it sprout, because we keep referring to it as sprout. Therefore, we say, in dependence on us calling it continuously a sprout, we say it's remaining. But we can at the same time say it's ceasing. It's going out of existence, because each moment is changing. In each moment, it's moving closer towards the moment when we no longer call it a sprout and start calling it a plant. So therefore, conventionally, we can say the sprout was produced, the sprout remains, and at the same time ceases. And it's all correct, because in relation to the fact that its seed is no longer called a seed, we say produced. In relation to the fact that each moment of the sprout, although different, we can refer to it in dependence on its characteristics, its cluster of atoms, can refer to it to a sprout. So in relation to that, we say it remains. But in relation to the fact that each moment of the sprout is nonetheless different, because the cluster of atoms has already changed in each moment, we say it's ceasing, but it's not inherently doing so. And that's what it says here. There is no production and no ceasing, no inherent production, implicit here, no inherent remaining, and no inherent ceasing. Does that make sense? So when we say something comes into existence and something has the potential to do, I have the potential to do this, and this person has that, and they give rise to it, it seems that there's just this process we're observing, but in and of itself, nothing is happening. In and of itself, nothing. It's us just labeling. And that is the lack of inherent existence of this process. But it goes further. The text doesn't stop there. What else does he say? Oops, I lost it. Oh, it's not stainless and not without stain. There's no inherent stainless, and there's no inherent without stain. Now, what does that mean, stain, stainless? Well, let's take another way of saying this. There's no inherent good and no inherent bad. There's no inherent positive, as in like good positive, and no inherent negative. What does that mean? Many of you have heard me say that. The Geshe Kelsang once gave a teaching, which he started, and I was translating. So he started saying, the first sentence was, the Buddha is bad. I was like, what? Again, like, can you repeat that? And he's like, the Buddha is bad. Hatred is good. Love is bad. Anger is good. And I kept asking, did you really say that? Yes, just repeat what I said, just translate what I said. So I did. And as it was to expect, everyone in the audience was like, whoa, what? Whoa. All Buddhists, right? Whoa, all the Buddhists head on, like, we're Buddhists. Whoa, the Buddha is bad, love is bad, etc. Okay. And then he said, the Buddha is bad because he harms something. Love is bad because it harms something. Anger is good because it benefits something. Hatred is good because it benefits something. And he went on to explain, the Buddha is bad because the Buddha harms suffering. Love is bad because it destroys suffering. Hatred is good because it gives rise to suffering. It benefits suffering. And then I understood what he was saying that good and bad is not intrinsic. It is in relation to what we want. In relation to the fact we want to have happiness, therefore anything that causes that happiness is called good, is called beneficial. Everything that destroys that which we want is called negative, bad. Now, in relation to love and hatred, that's universally true. That in general, any kind of action out of love causes a positive emotion in another person, positive feeling in another person, which in turn leads to a positive feeling we experience as a karmic result. So just like a law of nature, like a law of gravity, in the same way, certain causes give rise to certain effects. Therefore, love, compassion, etc., they cause in the person who generates them positive emotions. And since we want them, we say they're positive. If hypothetically we would love to suffer, a Buddha would be bad and hatred would be good. It's in relation to what we want. Now, here, love and compassion, that's universally true. With other things, like take any political situation, having settlements, some would say that's positive and some would say it's negative in relation to what people want. If there's a young couple that can't find a flat anywhere in Tel Aviv, it's too expensive, they can't find any living. If now there's a settlement and they are for the first time able to have their own, otherwise they'd be homeless, for that couple, it'd be good to have a house in a settlement. But for another person who says that is taking away the land of a Palestinian, from that perspective, it would be saying it is bad. It always depends. There's no intrinsic. What I'm saying is there's no intrinsic good or bad. It's always in relation to something other than itself that we say good or bad. So therefore here, to say if phenomena are not inherently produced, there's no inherent production, for instance, of suffering and happiness, then therefore, what about happiness and suffering? Or what about the production of love versus hatred? Are they inherently positive or negative? No, it's just in relation to how they affect us and in relation to what we want. Since they affect suffering, hatred leads to suffering. And since we don't want to suffer, we call it negative. And happiness, so we say one is stainless, as in like positive, as in like calling the wrong perception of reality, the wrong apprehension of reality, and the negative emotions stains. And the state that is free from those, stainless. So that again, having stains and stainless is not intrinsic to anything. It's only in relation to what we want and in relation to how certain factors affect us and bring us what we want or don't bring us what we want, lead to something else. We say stainless, or good and bad. Inherently, it's neither. In and of itself, hatred is neither good nor bad. Anger is neither good or bad, because in and of itself, it doesn't exist as anger, and none of those characteristics are intrinsic to it. It's only in relation to other factors that we call it that. Does that make sense? So some people say, well, there's no good and bad in Buddhism. That's wrong, because there is conventional good and bad. There's conventional good and bad, and it couldn't be anything more than a conventional good and bad. And that still makes it desirable and makes it necessary to increase our love versus our anger, because conventionally it still gives rise to the things we love, we want, happiness in the case of love, and pain and suffering in the case of hatred. All right, so this is what I'm saying here. There's nothing intrinsically stainless and not without stains. And therefore, there's also no decrease, deficient. It says here deficient, but I think that a better translation in English would be there's no decrease of negative qualities, right? Again, qualities, like even if they increase or decrease, they were never in and of themselves qualities. And there's also no increase. Like if you talk about just a simple idea of water, having water elements. The more water elements you have, the more water molecules, so H2O you have, you talk about an increase of water, right? But in the end, that's just the label we give on the basis of these different molecules. An increase, there's just more, and therefore we label increase, right? So instead of having or people, like in a city, instead of there being 5,000, now there's 10,000. So there's an increase. Can you find the increase within those people? No. Is it 5,000 people? Is there somewhere some increase to be found? No, it's just the label we give on the basis of previously having 500 and now having 10,000. If you previously didn't have 500, you wouldn't have an increase, right? Increase is always in relation to what was before. If you had more before, you wouldn't talk about it as an increase. So if now you have 10,000 and previously you have 5,000, on the basis of those two, we label increase. The increase happened when you had the 10,000, but it's dependent on less people before. And then the decrease is dependent on more before. You have the same amount of people, 10,000, okay? In one case, you had 5,000 before. In the other case, you had 50,000. In both cases, now you have 10,000. In one case, it's a decrease. In one case, it's an increase. It's the same amount. So therefore, it's not intrinsic. It's like this flower is long and short both. It's not intrinsic in it to be long. It's only in relation to something shorter, it's long. In relation to something longer, it's short. 10,000 people living in this village, in relation to the fact that previously there were less, there's an increase. In relation to previously there being more, there's a decrease. In and of itself, neither increase nor decrease. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? So this also reminds me of our sense of win and loss, increase and decrease. Remember the 8 worldly dharmas, and one of them is we're attached to gain and we're attached to avoiding loss. That's 2 of the worldly dharmas. Okay, so our life evolves around those worldly dharmas. Okay, good reputation, attachment to good reputation, to gain, to pleasure, and to praise. And attachment to avoiding loss, unpleasant experiences, a bad reputation, and critique, being criticized, critique or criticized. This is what governs our life, what rules our life, basically. So, therefore, when you take win and loss, it's such an interesting idea. I notice when I change money, whenever I change money, when I go back to India or you know, traveling back and forth to other countries, so you change money. So today I get, let's say for €1, I get 80 rupees. If I read somewhere that yesterday the exchange rate was 85 to the euro, today I'm thinking, oh, that's a loss. I lost something. I lost money. I never planned. My plan was today to change money. I never know what the rate is going to be like in the future. So today I've got time. Today I'm changing money. So I get 80 rupees. But since I hear yesterday was 85, I'm thinking, oh, shoot, I lost money. I never lost money. I got 80 rupees. Okay, that's the exchange rate. But on the other hand, I hear yesterday was 75, I feel, yes, I win money, I get money. It seems there's an intrinsic loss or win, but I got the same money, 80 rupees in both cases, right? But it's in relation to the exchange rate the previous day, and like, bummer, I should have done it yesterday. I can't change it, but I feel like I should have done it. I lost all this money. Maybe I even calculate. I don't want to calculate. I don't want to know how much I lost. I didn't lose anything. I didn't lose anything because I got the same amount in both cases. So it seems there's a loss, but it's only labeled on the basis of the fact that yesterday, which I didn't exchange money yesterday, so it's out of the question. But if I had, I would have gotten more. So I label loss or I label profit. It's the same here with increase and decrease, even increase of qualities, decrease of qualities. If today you have a certain amount and we talk about it as a decrease, that's only in relation to something other than itself. There's no intrinsic increase or decrease. Therefore, if we label positive or negative qualities, and it's in particular with regard to Dharma practice, we talk about an increase of positive qualities and a decrease of negative qualities. Well, since they're not intrinsically positive or negative, and there's no intrinsic, absolute increase, decrease, objective, etc., increase and decrease, there is no inherent, and therefore, yes, there's no inherent decrease and increase, as it says here, no increase, no decrease. It says deficient and fulfilled. I don't think that's a good translation because it refers to increasing good or bad qualities, negative or positive qualities. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? To a certain degree? No, Leora, it doesn't?
I fail to see the whole picture. We are talking about a division to 8, and I prefer, as you hinted, 1 + 7.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand. I don't know if I should just understand the explanation or try to understand the division. First, you said it makes sense to me. Without characteristic, all the aspects of phenomena, the entity has many aspects. They are all lack of objective existence or inherent. And then the production and coming out of production, this is, I thought, the entity itself also lack of inherent existence. This which is
okay, Leora, let me just cut you short there. I'll explain you. Okay. Yes, I did mention it briefly last time. So there are different ways to approach this, but the way it is explained in the commentaries, in some commentaries, it says, basically you could see it like a discussion between someone who follows the Prasangika, the Madhyamika school, who understands inherent existence, and another person who, when you say all phenomena lack inherent existence, so another person could say, well, that means phenomena don't have characteristics. And in answer to that, no, they have no inherent characteristics. Their nature is emptiness. In other words, they lack inherent existence. That means they don't have any inherent characteristics. And then another person may say, well, does that mean they don't come into existence? As in, like, does that mean that good qualities cannot be generated and negative qualities can not go out of existence, as an example, right? Does that mean nothing comes into existence and nothing goes out of existence? And in answer to that, no, there's nothing intrinsic to phenomena that makes it possible for it to be intrinsically produced or intrinsically going to get out of existence. And does that mean there's nothing positive and negative that can be produced? And so there's nothing positive and negative, therefore? And in answer to that, no, there isn't. There's no intrinsic good or bad, positive or negative. And then in answer to, and then again, well, does that mean you cannot increase good qualities and decrease bad qualities as you should do as part of your practice? And again, no, not at all. It's not possible. You can also formulate it differently. You can basically say, since all phenomena lack inherent existence, they have no inherent characteristics. Nothing we can say about them, about their size or shape or anything that's intrinsic to them. Since they don't have any, they don't exist intrinsically, then there's also no intrinsic giving rise to them, bringing them into existence and taking them out of existence. And what are we interested in terms of production in Buddhism? Well, we want to produce positive qualities and want to get rid of negative qualities, but there are no intrinsic positive or negative qualities. And therefore there's no intrinsic increase in good qualities and intrinsic decrease in qualities, right? So you could take it that way. You could see it as an argument between another person asking, does that mean there isn't such and such? Or even leaving that out, just understanding that the fact is that nothing exists intrinsically, and even our Dharma practice, so using this idea to now generate conventional qualities, well, those cannot be found, and not even an increase in good qualities and bad ones, and decrease in negative ones, that cannot be found. So in other words, we're looking at Dharma practice from each angle. We can of course talk about it also in an ordinary sense, because actually we talk about Dharma practice as a path, right? We use the word path as a method, as a cause to a certain result. But actually in the scriptures, you use the word path also for samsara. Just this weekend, I taught a course on Precious Garland, Nagarjuna's Precious Garland, the second chapter. So the second chapter, and we did a short review of the first chapter. And in the first chapter, it talks about, I think now, since I just did it, I think it's verse 85, where it talks about the three paths of cyclic existence. It talks about three aspects of the 12 links of dependent arising: the karmic aspects, the aspects which are afflictive emotions, and the resultant aspects. So really just causes for cyclic existence. They're all called path. So they're also methods. They're methods to samsaric experiences. Sometimes in English, people don't like to use the word path because they feel a path must be something virtuous, must take us, but it's not true. Right now, my motivation, my main motivation is my happiness, I, me, and mine, and my samsaric happiness. That's my path. And everything is motivated by my wish to bring this forth, right? And therefore I act that way, and the result is my samsaric experiences. If I generate the wish to liberate myself from this samsaric existence and to generate nirvana, or to attain nirvana, then everything I do becomes a path to liberation. If instead of that, I'm not concerned with myself, I'm concerned totally for the benefit, I'm for the welfare of the sentient beings, and everything I do is a means to an end, Buddhahood, to bring forth the welfare of the sentient beings, then my path, everything I do will take me towards that. That's the power of the mind. Right now, to tell you honestly, my interest is totally samsara, my samsaric happiness. That's my path. And so likewise, I can also apply this. All phenomena are empty. So without characteristic, even my samsaric path has no characteristics. It's not inherently produced and inherently unceased. There's no inherent good qualities and negative qualities, and there's no inherent increase or decrease when it comes to my samsaric path, or the path that is non-samsaric, that takes me to liberation or Buddhahood. That's what this means. Leora, does that make sense now?
Very much so, thank you.
Okay, good, great. Now we're done with the 8 aspects. Aren't they beautiful? They're my total favorite, my new favorite. I love the 4 profundities, but these ones, they're so amazing. There's so much in these 8 aspects, and I don't know, I came across a commentary, it didn't say much about it, and something had that effect on me, and it all fell into place. And I think it's so beautiful how the Heart Sutra looks at all these aspects: production, ceasing, being stainless, not stainless, increase and decrease. It's not there, not inherently at least, right? So looking at it from all different angles, samsaric path or nirvanic path, right? The path to nirvana or Buddhahood. All right. But there's also a way in which you can take those 8, and this is what His Holiness says in his explanation on, and not just His Holiness, also the other commentaries talk about these 8 by way of dividing them into what are called the 3 doors to liberation. These words, I know they're really odd. The 3 doors to liberation. Okay, don't get caught up in the words. All it's doing is talking about emptiness, and describing it as a door to liberation. Okay, as a means, as a method. So sometimes you use the word path, sometimes you use the word gateway or door or whatever, right? Path, vehicle, all these ideas where something takes you somewhere, opens some new possibility for you. So emptiness here can be called a door, a gateway. But there's 3 types of emptiness that you can talk about here. 3 types. One type is where you take the emptiness of the object itself, the emptiness of its cause, and the emptiness of its result. And we've already done this in a certain way here. We've done all this analysis, but here we talk about 3 doors of liberation, the 3 doors to liberation, I should say. The 3 doors to liberation. The first one is the door of liberation with regard to the emptiness of the nature of this object, the emptiness of the object itself. The next door is the emptiness of the causes of this object itself, and then the results of it. And again, you can take the sprout, the seed, the sprout, and the plant. Okay? The sprout, the cause is the seed, the result is the plant. Okay, and the analysis we did before, you can apply it to that. But here, what the commentators do, they say you can divide those 8 and basically categorize those 8 as belonging to one of those 3 doors. Okay, now let me give the terminology of those 3 doors or 3 gateways. Both words work, it depends. Go, namta gosum, also literally the 3 doors to liberation. So the first one is called namta gosum. What's the first one? Oh, is the door of emptiness. It's just called the door of emptiness. Namta gosum. I've actually forgot. I think I just need to 가서 남바타고 동반 얘기. 남바타고. Sorry, I don't remember right now. I think it's Namtagosum. The 3 gates to liberation. Yeah, first is emptiness. Emptiness itself is the first door. The second door is signlessness. And the third door is wishlessness. Okay, they have given these names. The first door is called emptiness itself. The next door is called signlessness without a sign. Sign often has the connotation of characteristic, signlessness. And the last one is the door of wishlessness. And now, when you look at these 8, and again to remind you, the door of emptiness is described as the emptiness of an object itself. The next door, the door of signlessness, is described as the emptiness of the cause of that object. And the next door, the door of wishlessness, is the emptiness of the result of that object. So looking at an object from the point of view of its nature, its cause, and its result. So again, a very thorough approach, as in like taking the sprout. What is its nature? It doesn't exist as a sprout itself. Looking at its cause, the seed doesn't exist in itself, and even its result, the plant, doesn't exist in itself. That would be a quick version of the whole thing. And now these 8, as I just mentioned, they're now included in those, and that's maybe a little bit difficult. So I'll say it now. We'll do definitely a meditation on this. But before that, just quickly, I'll mention how they belong to each door. And next time, hopefully, it'll be clear. And then we can also continue with the next paragraph. But just to your information, so the words, all phenomena are emptiness without characteristic, that refers to the door of emptiness, which deals just with the nature of an object itself, not with its cause, not with its result, the object itself. So taking an example such as the mind or a table, etc., or the sprout. Okay, so this lacks inherent existence. The table, the sprout cannot be found as a sprout, and its characteristics cannot be found. So it deals with the object itself. The thing as a sprout, it's not inherently a sprout, and its characteristics of being short or long or big or small or any of those intrinsically cannot be found. Okay, that's the door of liberation of emptiness. Okay, or the door of liberation called emptiness. Okay, that's the first one. Now, the second one, when it comes to the cause, the word unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stains, are part of the door of liberation that is signlessness, that deals specifically with the cause of something. So when we look at the cause, for the cause, it's itself produced and it ceases to give rise to its effect. So in that way, you can look at it like the seed itself. It's not inherently produced. It itself, of course, was produced and has to cease in order to become the sprout. So that's the cause of the sprout. But being produced by its own cause, so the seed also has a cause that gave rise to it, but it wasn't produced inherently, and it doesn't cease inherently. Therefore, in terms of the cause, you could say these two characteristics describe the cause of the sprout. Okay, you can look at it that way. That's just an interpretation here. You can look at it differently. And then also stainless and not without stains. Actually, whether something is positive or negative, we don't just look at the result it gives rise to, but also what causes it. In particular, we talk about what causes anger. Well, it's the wrong perception of reality. It's our misperception of reality. So therefore, we say it's stainless or non-stainless, it's contaminated or not in relation to what gave rise to it. In that way, again, it's its cause. What gives rise to anger that makes it negative, that makes it contaminated? It's the wrong apprehension of reality. What makes the mind of a Buddha stainless? Well, the correct perception of reality makes it stainless. So again, from that perspective, we can also say it's a different explanation as the one I gave before with regard to the categorization of those three doors. So here, taking those not being inherently produced, not inherently ceasing, not inherently stainless, and not inherently without stains from the point of view of a cause. And then the last one are with regard to the result. So whether something increases or decreases, qualities decrease or increase as a result of everything that went before, our practice, etc. Here, looking at it from the point of view of the result, that is the door of wishlessness. It's just another explanation. It's another way of explaining those 8. I've explained them in response to Leora's question in a certain way before. Now they're again explained in a slightly different way. And I know it's complicated, but it's so helpful for the mind to make our mind more flexible, to look at all these different aspects in slightly different ways. I know it's really frustrating the first time when you don't understand, but trust me, when you do, it's really wonderful experience to look at it that way. So I went through the same. I look at your faces and I see my own face in them. When I learned this commentary as preparation for this classes and other classes I taught, I was like, are you kidding me? I thought the hardest part was over. Again, they make it even more difficult. It was so frustrating initially. All this new information, I thought I'd, done the worst part. And then slowly I thought about it back and forth and back. And then it's almost like light is switching on and you're like, oh, that's what they mean. That's amazing, right? So just wait for that moment. You're still in that mode of frustration, I guess, because it's just frustrating, all this information. I'm totally enthusiastic now, but trust me, I wasn't before. I was like, oh no, not again. This is so bizarre. Who comes up with these ideas, with things of this, right? But anyway, all right. So I think we've got enough for now. That was a full load of stuff, I think. But as I said, it's very rewarding when you understand it. And I'll just briefly go over it again next time. And I read through it like 5-6 times. And every time it was a little easier until I had this moment. That's what it means. And there it was. And that's just how it works when we learn these things. It's about reading, hearing about it again. And it's just so beautiful. It's so profound. And of course, initially, it's just the intellectual kind of sense, that's what it refers to. But of course, now, how do we make it relevant to our own life? And I think maybe we can have a little bit of input next time, because this is so highly abstract and it's beautiful, but it should also be right there, relevant to our own life. That's, of course, the big challenge. And that's your homework. That's your homework. How can you make these 8? And you don't need to take them the way I explained, like decrease and increase numbers of people in Tel Aviv or what have you, or good or bad qualities. It could be anything. It could be anything. When in your life is there a sense something was produced, something went out of existence, something was positive and negative and increased and decreased and had certain characteristics, and then you remind yourself, oh yeah, but not intrinsically, not inherently. Especially when there's strong emotions that in relation to increase, decrease, positive, negative, you react with attachment, with anger. Your anger and your attachment, they can only function. They're like fire that can only burn if there's fuel. What is the fuel? Misperception, the perception of inherent existence. You can be 100% sure, even if you're not aware of it, when you have anger, you perceive any of those 8 as inherently existent. Guaranteed. Probably more than those 8. Because it's a lot more complicated. It's a whole situation. This person is responsible. They created the problem. They are the cause for it. Therefore, I have a bad reputation. There's an intrinsic bad reputation, and there's a decrease in my salary because of that. There, you got all of them, right? An inherently existent person, an inherently with inherently negative characteristics, who has produced these problems, who sees my opportunity inherently, who is inherently bad, and I'm inherently good, and my salary has been decreased and his has gone up, right? All in there. It all seems to be inherently taking place. But let's look at it again, right? It's just a matter of drink a cup of tea, calm down, all right? Then look at the situation again that seems so solid and intrinsically. Let's look at it again. Say now, let's pass through the situation again and look, was it intrinsically? Was the other person? You just need to take it apart. It's complicated because your thoughts are complicated. Because you have a whole chain of thoughts, one giving rise to the next, one giving rise to the, and you need to look at those. They totally lead you to incredible emotions. It's so rapid. It's at the speed of light, and it leads to you feeling miserable and being depressed. Now you look, what gave rise to that feeling? Take it apart. If you have the presence of mind, if you've got that relaxed state, take some time and go through it. And you make a habit out of it. And before long, every situation, you're actually automatically looking at it. Is it, and there's no fuel for that anger. There's no fuel for that upsetness because you're missing that aspect. And that means even without realizing emptiness, you're bringing emptiness in your everyday life, and you're able to deal with these so solidly appearing problems, challenges, insults, etc. That's the solution to our problems. We're not going to change the world. We're not going to stop people acting in a way that we don't want them to act. We can only stop our perception of them, which does not accord with reality. It's as simple as that. Do we have time for meditation? Different reactions. I see all of you, by the way. I got that gallery kind of, so I'm going from one to the other.
We have 10 minutes.
You have 10 minutes. Okay, we'll do the meditation. Great. If in the meantime, time is up, my problem is just that it oftentimes longer. If in the meantime you need to leave, just don't worry about it. Just lock yourself off. And then if there's still some there, otherwise I'll be the only one and I do the dedication on my own, and that's fine as well. All right, let's start with some breathing, a few moments of breathing. just let go of any disruptive thoughts and just be in the moment. And now first, take to mind an object such as a sprout. That appears to exist in and of itself. As having certain characteristics, a color, a shape, certain size, a smell, and so forth. First of all, can you find that sprout? Within this appearing object? Is it part of the leaf, the stem, the color? Or is it separate from all of those? And how about those characteristics, the color, shape? Colors are merely labeled on the basis of how light waves appear to our mind. While a shape is labeled on the appearance of colors. The quality of being big is labeled in relation to something smaller. Which means there is neither an intrinsic sprout nor any intrinsic qualities of the sprout. And if that's true for something as simple as a sprout, it's likewise true for a person, for the eye, for a situation, or any other phenomenon. It doesn't inherently exist as that object. It has no inherent characteristics. Therefore, it was not inherently produced. That is, it hasn't inherently come into existence. It does not inherently cease. That is, go out of existence. It's merely in relation to a previous moment that has transformed and that we now identify as problem, that we label the problem has been produced. When there's actually no inherent problem, nor any inherent coming into existence of the problem. Just as there's no inherent sprout and no inherent production of the sprout. Likewise, there's no ceasing of anything that takes place inherently. Other than us ceasing to call a sprout or a problem a problem. Therefore, there's also no inherent positive or good, and no inherent negative or bad. In relation to what we want, we label that which gives rise to what we want as positive, or good, and in relation to that which we don't want and which gives rise to that as negative or bad. In and of itself, it's neither. And therefore, there's also no intrinsic increase of any phenomenon, such as something positive or negative. There's no inherent decrease either. It's only in relation to what was there before. If there was more of something before and there's less now, we impute decrease. If there was less now and there are less before and more now, we label increase. While there's no independent or inherent decrease nor increase. So now, to conclude this meditation, whatever kind of feeling has arisen as a result of this analysis, take a moment to focus on that feeling and allow for it to sink deeper into your mind. Okay, now slowly arise from your meditation, and then let's dedicate whatever virtue we've accumulated. Let's dedicate this towards our own enlightenment, a state in which we remove whatever is extra in our mind, any obstructions to enlightenment, so that we're able to work for the welfare of all sentient beings in the most effective way. And let's recite Shantideva's prayer if we have it. Great. Thank you. Avi, I think it is. Thank you. Okay. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose body are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the hopeless find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all the medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and the people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain, to dispel the miseries of the world. Okay, thank you very much. I've been thinking the whole time, I forgot something. I think we didn't do the beginning prayers. We're doing the prayers, right? That's what I forgot. Well, I taught a course today, and I did the motivation every session again and again, and somehow it kind of registered we did this already, and I forgot. Anyway, next time we'll start. Please remind me if I forget. At least we did the dedication, so yeah, hopefully you did the motivation. And I wish you a lovely week. Please, well, reflect upon, if you can, bring into your own life those 8 aspects, and let's hear about them next time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.